Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this August session of our monthly webinar series. I'm Dana Ripper with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Ethan Duke of MRBO is also here with us tonight, and the mission of MRBO is the conservation of birds and all wildlife via science, education, and advocacy. And we're very happy that you've joined us this evening. Welcome back to folks that have been with us, and welcome to the new folks that are on here. Since we're monthly now, there are times when we have weekly webinars, but we're monthly. I like to remind everyone of what is upcoming. In September, we have Missouri's own Leah Gastonguay speaking about entomology in September, and Dr. Jen Riley speaking about cats and wildlife in October. And that cats topic is one that people have been asking us for a while. So I hope everybody can tune in for that. I'm going to throw registration links into the chat once I am done, so that you can access them easily. I also want to note that there are, 13 days left on MRBO's annual photo contest. It ends August 31st. So if you are a bird photographer, amateur only, please consider entering our photo contest. I'll put that link in the chat as well. So on to our webinar. We met tonight's speaker, Dr. Heather Barron, along with our October speaker, Dr. John Riley, at an American Bird Conservancy fly-in Washington, D.C. last April. So we were there, a bunch of different people from a lot of different organizations across the country, all there to advocate on behalf of birds and other wildlife to our members of Congress, about things such as pesticides and habitat related policies. So not only is our speaker tonight an expert on the topic she's going to tell us about, she is also an active, strong advocate for wildlife. Heather Barron is currently the Chief Science Officer and Veterinarian at Loggerhead Marine Life Center. Dr. Barron received residency training in zoological medicine and was later tenured faculty at the University of Georgia's College of Veterinary Medicine. She obtained international experience as a professor and department head of clinical medicine at St. Matthew's University in the Cayman Islands, where she was also the veterinarian for the Cayman Turtle Farm and Cayman Wildlife Rescue. She then moved to the Clinic for the Rehabilitation of Wildlife, acronym CROW, where she was medical and research director for over a decade. Her research interests focus on the intersection of wildlife, human, and environmental health. Dr. Barron is a licensed wildlife and sea turtle rehabilitator with 30 years of experience in researching, practicing, and teaching wildlife medicine. So I'm also going to put her website in the chat of her organization. And Heather, I shall now turn it over to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I'm super excited to talk to you about toxins in wildlife. I am a veterinarian who's been doing wildlife medicine for the past 30 years and have a number of books and journal publications in this area. But one of my favorite things to do is definitely teach, and I would love to have this be a very interactive session. I don't need to be a sage on the stage up here. I'm delighted for you guys to ask questions throughout or to share experiences. If we don't get through all the slides, it's no big deal. If we do get through all the slides, then we'll definitely have some time for questions at the end. And I think this picture that I put together up here sort of typifies the way that I approach wildlife health, which is really from that one world, one health perspective, which means we're really looking at that interrelationship between environmental health, human health, and animal health, whether wild or domestic. And you guys probably have lots of examples that you could share of why this is so important. Certainly, avian influenza kind of tops the list of those right now. But there are a number of examples, and where I was at Crow, which was Sanibel Island, was a very important place that really underscored that one world, one health and a lot of the cases that we saw. We saw about 6,000 wildlife cases a year. Over here on the East Coast, where I am now, we also see a large number of wildlife cases, both through our partners at Bush Wildlife Center. We're seeing about 5 to 6,000 cases a year. And then also at Loggerhead Marine Life Center, where we strictly rehabilitate sea turtles. Okay, so let's plunge in here. Mm, Come on, screen advance. There we go. Okay, so let's start with anthropogenic pollutants, which are those man-made toxins, and we'll talk a little bit as time goes on about some of the natural toxins that are out there. But we'll start with the human ones because they certainly are very significant. Globally, roughly there are 400 million tons of chemicals produced annually, and humans are just getting better and better at that. So, really, over the past 100 years or so, it's amazing all of the different chemicals that we have developed. And unfortunately for us and for the earth, many of these are very persistent, and many do what we call bioaccumulate, which means they kind of build up in systems and particularly in the food chain. And many of them tend to stick around and not go away very easily. And in fact, roughly 10% of the patients that we admit to rehabilitation now come in for some type of toxicoses. And additionally, we did a study that showed about 96% of the baby sea turtles that wash back out of the ocean are coming in because they are full of plastics. And we're doing a number of studies now looking at the significance of that, but certainly it is having a fairly dire effect on the population dynamics for these endangered sea turtle species. It also has a significant effect on America's bird life. It is estimated that we have lost over 3 billion birds over the past 50 years. And I think that that even underestimates that number to some degree. Certainly, there have been up to 300 man-made chemicals that are found to persist in humans, and we'll talk about some of the other wildlife species that they have been found to persist in as well. But it certainly is an issue that is becoming more and more pertinent as time goes on, and one that we're certainly very aware of if we work in wildlife health. And so I wanted to just start with this simple case report of an osprey that we took in over on the West Coast. I think you guys probably all have seen enough healthy wild osprey to appreciate that this is not a normal bird. This bird came in with these neurologic signs, and there were a variety of things that we had to consider with this. So we certainly looked at metabolic issues, so maybe potassium abnormalities. There's also something called capture myopathy that these guys can occasionally get. Nutritional issues. So, in captivity, we see birds who look like this if they have been fed frozen fish, but they're not being supplemented with vitamins. A lot of infectious diseases. We mentioned avian influenza earlier, and certainly we are seeing a lot of raptors these days with avian influenza that look very much like this. West Nile virus is also another big one where the birds can look like this. Newcastle's disease virus, toxoplasmosis. I know we tend to think of toxo as something that you have to be careful if you're a pregnant woman and you have a cat. But believe it or not, toxoplasma has become a huge problem for marine wildlife, a variety of different marine wildlife. So it's a big problem in your pinnipeds like seals and sea lions. and it is also a problem in many of our birds. And then fungal things like aspergillosis are always something to consider. Obviously, trauma is the number one reason why wildlife presents to wildlife centers. However, we also had to rule out a large number of toxins. So things like harmful algal blooms, and where I was on Sanibel was kind of harmful algal blooms central. Things like mercury, lead, zinc, caffeine, botulism, organophosphates, carbamates, barbiturates. We particularly see in scavengers like eagles, a lot of animals. That are euthanized in large or small animal medicine may be taken to the local dump, and then scavengers pick up that euthanasia solution by feeding on those carcasses. So those were sort of our full differential list. As it turns out, we were able to do some pretty significant diagnostic testing to rule a lot of these things out, and we were eventually able to rule mercury toxicosis in. And so that kind of brings us to, I'm sure you guys know that osprey feed on fish, and they can feed on both fresh and saltwater fish. But in our area, they pretty much tend to hang out in the estuary. And so the first thing you think when you see a bird coming in for mercury toxicosis that eats predominantly fish is, okay, why are the mercury levels so high in the fish? And what does that mean for the people who are probably also eating those fish? And so it really led to a fairly large investigation of what was going on in our water basin in that area, and kind of got me started on looking at a lot of things in terms of water and water quality in our area. And so, when I think about water and water use in the 21st century, I really think about the ripple effect, which means even somebody in North Florida could have been contributing to some of the problems that we were seeing in our estuary area off of Sanibel Island. And that's because there are about 1.2 trillion gallons of untreated sewage, stormwater, and industrial waste that are discharged into U.S. waters annually. And as a result of that, over 40% of our rivers are considered really too polluted for it to be safe to go fishing and eat those fish, to swim, and especially for the aquatic life that lives there. And in fact, because of the water quality in US waters, aquatic animals' estimated extinction rate is actually 5 times that of terrestrial animals. And I think because it's below the water, a lot of people don't think about marine life and the impacts that the way humans live and treat the earth are having on those animals. But if you do focus on marine health like I do, you know it's pretty horrific, and animals that we haven't even discovered yet are probably dying every day. And, when we think about the wildlife, I think, here I'm kind of preaching to the choir because you guys obviously care about wildlife, or you probably wouldn't be on this call. But I speak to a lot of business groups and other groups around the world that aren't necessarily tree and turtle hugging person like I am. And so we have to really think about how can we make some of these things pertinent for them. And wildlife health, the way I look at what I do is I'm not just concerned about the individual animal. I am also concerned about wildlife population health. But when I became a veterinarian, I took an oath to use my knowledge of animal health to make sure that humans stayed healthy too. And so that is, again, really sort of the cornerstone of what I feel like I do in wildlife health. That one world, one health concept, we always come back to that. And I think when people think about water, they, turn on the tap, they get their water, and it's they don't drop dead immediately when they drink it, and so they think everything's good. And they assume that our government is protecting them and the waters that they drink and that they go out and recreate on. And I think that that really is a misconception by the American public. And so, I think a lot of us believe, oh, well, the government is there to protect me. And a number of years ago, they came up with the Safe Drinking Water Act in order to try to make sure that the water that you drink every day is safe for you. However, there was an NRDC or Natural Resource Defense Council that came out in 2017 that showed that basically on at any given time, roughly a fourth of the U.S. population, or about 80 million people, were being served by water systems that had violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And when NRDC looked into that, they found that 9 out of 10 of those water systems who had violations really didn't even get a slap on the wrist. And so, yes, they had violations, but they weren't really being held accountable for those violations, which means those violations were probably just happening repeatedly. And it had been even, keeping in mind that until recently, EPA hadn't set a single standard for drinking water contaminants since 1996. Finally, with the Biden administration, EPA did set up 6 new standards for PFAS contaminants. And I know you guys have all heard of PFAS and PFOS, but these are our perfluorinated chemicals. They're what we call the forever chemicals, and they have been shown to do a wide variety of very bad things for people and for animals. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit. But I think more and more, as we do more research, we realize there are so many contaminants out there that have been shown to have serious consequences for both people and animals. And yet the EPA is not setting any new standards for these contaminants, that there are so many studies that show that they are in the water, and they are a serious concern for both humans and people. And certainly I wouldn't expect that to change anytime in the next 3 years or so. From 1930 to 2000, the world's chemical production increased by over 400 times. So, in many ways, humanity is the hope for the earth. But in so many ways, we are really poisoning ourselves. And there are so many unregulated chemicals in our water, and again, there is very little known about health effects, particularly when you look at chronic exposure. So, yeah, we know, that there are probably not a whole lot of contaminants where people are just dropping dead, because if there were, then, governments tend to pay a little more attention. But even when toxins are regulated, usually they are only regulating for the maximum levels that would be for acute exposure or acute toxicity. So, in other words, they're looking to make sure that the lead levels or the arsenic or the mercury levels aren't so high that you don't just drop dead a week after you've been drinking out of that tap. But in general, they are not looking at things like endocrine disrupting chemicals or EDCs, which typically are important even in the parts per billion or parts per trillion level. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that because there are some scary things out there. And how many of you guys have heard of endocrine disrupting chemicals? So you can just like raise your hand or let me know in the chat. But it's becoming sort of a big buzzword, and I think probably a lot of you guys have heard of these things because more and more there are is a lot of research showing that they are certainly very concerning for both wildlife and for people. And in fact, the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, actually publishes a list of endocrine disruptors, and they publish what they called the Dirty Dozen, which was 12 hormone altering chemicals and how you might potentially avoid those in your own drinking water at home. So I can tell you, I have multiple filters on my house and on my drinking water, even though it's city water. I do not trust them. And certainly when I had well water, I had lots of filtration there as well. And currently, there are about 1,000 suspected endocrine disrupting chemicals, including things like phthalates, BPA or bisphenol A, the flame retardants, the industrial chemicals, including the alkylphenols, metals and dioxins, air pollutants like your PCAs or your polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and then, of course, a wide variety of pesticides and certainly the PFAS and PFOS that we talked about earlier. And so what does that mean for us? Why should we care? Well, there's just tons and tons of studies that show um, how this is affecting people and potentially why you should care. So, for example, one study in Denmark showed that over approximately 50 years, they saw a 50% decrease in sperm count and quality, and then, not surprisingly, a decrease in the conception rate in that country. And certainly, the herbicide atrazine is one of the most commonly detected endocrine disrupting chemicals in U.S. waters. And so, again, why do we care? Well, certainly from the wildlife side, which is predominantly where I care, but I also have 3 small children, so I care for them as well. And one of the things that atrazine has been shown to do is it induces feminization and causes testicular lesions in basically every class of animal that you can think of. So fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. And in fact, exposure to atrazine can turn genetically male frogs into females. And another good example of some EDCs here in the state of Florida, we have a number of beautiful lakes, and one of those is Lake Apopka, which is the fourth largest lake in the state of Florida. And a number of years ago, there was an industrial accident that resulted in the organochlorine level in that lake becoming very elevated. And one of the things that that resulted in was a huge decrease in fertility for alligators in that lake. Now, I know not everybody loves alligators, but they do serve a pretty important role in our ecosystem. And what they were seeing in this particular lake, when they compared it to lakes that were sort of cleaner and more wild, was that there was a very low clutch viability, and the males suffered from microphallus. And so all that resulted in them only having about a 20% fertility and clutch success rate versus 87% in the clean lakes. And I'll tell you, I talked to a lot of different people from all walks of life about, wildlife and this one world, one health concept. And a lot of times, you can kind of see their eyes glazing over until I bring up that there are chemicals out there that humans have produced that can cause small penises and decrease their fertility. And then suddenly people start to pay attention. And so this is, a lot of what I do. I try to help people understand why, even if they aren't a turtle hugger like me, all of this is important for them. And it is important. And companies who actually make their living off of human health, like Swiss Re. I don't know if you guys have heard of Swiss Re. It is a company that insures human health insurance companies. And so their big job is to try to figure out what is the next big thing coming down the pike that is going to have a significant effect on human health because they want to try to get out in front of that so that they don't have health insurance companies that are losing a lot of money and are coming to them, to keep them solvent. And according to them, endocrine disrupting chemicals are going to become the world's number one health risk very shortly. And hold on one second for me. Sorry. Okay, so and so we started looking at some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that were sort of in that dirty dozen list. And one of the big things that came up for us here in the state of Florida was methylmercury. And what we are seeing here in our state, particularly in ibis, which are kind of like the feral chickens of Florida, they're really everywhere, is that chronic exposure to methylmercury was really impairing reproduction rates in this species. And so even for fertile eggs, they had a very low hatch rate. It was resulting in poor parenting, and it was resulting in an increase of the number of homosexual bonds. And all of that was resulting in 50% fewer fledglings when compared to waterways or areas that had low methylmercury levels. Another thing, and again, we talked about this earlier, is your perfluorinated chemicals, so your PFCs in things like Teflon and your Scotch guarded fabrics and things like that can really affect thyroid function and also sex hormone levels, and that these chemicals really resist biodegradation, which means, again, that they are forever chemicals that tend to stick around in your body. And we had talked a little bit about PFAS, but I also wanted to mention PFOS, which has been detected in drinking water and in some of the most protected wildlife species in some of the most pristine environments on Earth, including 100% of polar bears, bottlenose dolphins, bald eagle nestlings, and Laysan albatross. And so that's pretty bad if you think about it. Basically, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, some of them are in species that you would never guess that they were contaminated. And again, many of our marine species are severely affected. But there's more. Arsenic is also a potent endocrine disrupting chemical and carcinogen that is found in waters worldwide, and it is considered one of the top environmental health threats and can cause skin, bladder, and lung cancer. And in a study in free-ranging black kites in Portugal, they found that arsenic levels were 3 times what they were seeing in captive conspecifics that were getting, well filtered and uh, presumably cleaner water, and that lead levels were 4 times greater in the wild animals versus the captive conspecifics. So, really concerning in terms of the health of our wildlife. And another huge thing that we see all the time is pharmaceutical residues. So, what happens when our birth control pills or our uh, antibiotics get flushed down the toilet. Well, some of that stuff is really not filtered out in our water treatment plant facilities, and so what we see is it goes back into our water supply, and that is resulting in, for example, with the antibiotics, a lot of antimicrobial resistance. So we are getting these bacterial superbugs that more and more do not respond to antibiotics because of all the antibiotic residues that are out there in our planet. And so for me as a veterinarian, this has really had a big impact on the way that I practice and the way that I dispose of, for example, barbiturates. Now when I have to euthanize animals, and sometimes that does happen that we have to do that, those animals certainly do not go into a landfill. Instead, they will be incinerated, and that way, hopefully, keeping other wild animals safe. And I think, a lot of us believe, oh, well, if humans find out this is a problem and they enact legislation to help prevent these problems, for example, back in the 70s when, Silent Spring came out and people first started sort of sitting up and taking notice of DDT. So it initially was produced in the 1940s. I'm sure you guys all know it was leading to eggshell thinning in so many species of birds, but certainly pelicans, bald eagles, and osprey were some of the big ones. And so that led to the book Silent Spring, and eventually led to DDT being banned in the 70s. So I think the average person is like, great, our DDT problem is over. Unfortunately, this is one of those chemicals that does tend to really persevere in the environment as well as bioaccumulating. And what we see is that in the Great Lakes, there are still very, very high levels of this chemical. And it's kind of interesting. They were doing a study with bald eagles where they showed some of these bald eagles were nesting inland and they were producing very healthy, viable clutches. And yet, when these animals moved over to the Great Lakes, probably because of habitat destruction or a lack of food resources, they found that basically the Great Lakes were like a black hole for these eagles because their ability to produce healthy clutches decreased about 2 or so years after arrival. And when they started looking at the eggs in the nests that had been abandoned, they found 10 times the safe levels of DDT. And so, again, some of these forever chemicals should be very concerning for all of us. A lot of people fish in those Great Lakes and are eating the same things that these bald eagles would be eating. And so again, maybe they're not dropping dead immediately, but you really have to think about the long-term carcinogenic or cancer-causing effects, as well as the endocrine disrupting effects. We're seeing more and more obesity, diabetes, all kinds of issues that probably many of these, the hypothyroidism, things like that, could have a link to these endocrine disruptors. And certainly, water is one of our greatest resources. More people die from poor water quality annually than from all forms of violence, including war. And it's very interesting that so many people are focused on climate change. And when you talk to, companies out there that have an interest in One Health and environmental challenges, many of them do have a plan for reducing their impact on climate change. But when you ask them, do you have a plan for protecting our local waters? Many of them do not, and many of them are guilty of polluting our local waters. And more, humans are realizing water is becoming a very precious resource that it's not really going to matter how much money you have if you can't get a hold of any clean water anywhere. And certainly, this was a huge problem for me when I lived on Sanibel, because one of the largest lake in the state of Florida is Lake Okeechobee. And here in the background, you're seeing this sort of beautiful picture of our waters that are normally a beautiful azure blue color. And in the background, you can see Sanibel Island here with a very iconic Sanibel lighthouse. And unfortunately, Lake Okeechobee, as well as being the largest lake in the state of Florida, is probably also the most polluted lake in the state of Florida. And it is set up with a system of dams and weirs. And when the Army Corps of Engineers decides that the water levels in the lake are getting too high from rain and from runoff of the watershed, which is basically the entire northern part of the state, well, that whole watershed empties into um, the Lake Okeechobee. And then that lake, the way if they open up the weirs to let some of the high waters out, it will dump either into the Caloosahatchee River, and about 70% of those waters do go through the Caloosahatchee River and basically emptied into my backyard right there in Sanibel. And the other 30% travel east and dump into my backyard here, right off of Juno Beach. And so, uh, not surprisingly, brevetoxicosis and other harmful algal blooms have been of huge interest to me, both clinically and from a research perspective. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Florida red tides. I know you guys are far away from Florida, but harmful algal blooms are important the world over. And while only 2% of species of algae worldwide are known to be harmful or toxic, those 2% occur in lakes as well as oceans. And so it's something that I think is pertinent for everyone. And when you have blooms of harmful algae, sometimes they will discolor the water as they have done here in this video, but not always. So you can't tell that there is potentially a harmful algae bloom and the toxins associated with that bloom just by looking at the water. And so, because of that, we do a lot of water quality testing at my lab at Loggerhead Marine Life Center, and certainly the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation and many other state and, sorry, not state, but local agencies were also very concerned with looking at the amount of algae in our waters there. And one of the reasons I was so concerned about it was because of the wildlife. So this is a double crested cormorant. And for those of you who are familiar with cormorants, you can probably tell he's definitely not normal. So no fear, we're not going to let him drown. The person taking this video is a wildlife biologist and was the um, person who was responsible for um, marine bird biology and tracking the health of birds in the Sanibel area. And so she rescued this bird right after she took this video and brought it right into me, where he was luckily very successfully treated. And red tides at the core are a problem with overgrowth and release of toxins from the dinoflagellate known as Caridia brevis. And K. brevis produces brevetoxins, which are a neurotoxin, which means they affect the nerves in all parts of the animal or the human's body. And this can be nerves that affect your heart, your muscles, your gastrointestinal tract, the ability to blink, many other things. And one thing that we have appreciated over the past 30 plus years is that red tides are getting worse, not just in Florida, but all over the world. And because Sanibel was one of those epicenters of K. brevis blooms, this became a very strong area of research interest for me. And this is why. So, what you're seeing here is our beach on Sanibel. Sanibel is considered the shelling capital of the world, and we are also considered an island that is a wildlife sanctuary. You guys may be familiar with Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. But it is not just the refuge where we're concerned about wildlife health. It is really all of the island. And so when you walk out on the beach and you see all of this dead marine life, it is highly impactful. And what you're seeing here is a dead loggerhead sea turtle, a dead Goliath grouper, a very iconic photo with the Sanibel lighthouse just in the background there, and also a dead juvenile whale shark that washed up on our beaches. And what all of these things have in common is they died from red tide poisoning. Now, we're very lucky that typically sea turtles are not affected because red tides usually bloom between October and April. And sea turtles typically are way out in the deep blue oceans and not in our nearshore waters. And luckily, they only come into our nearshore waters to nest between April and October. So usually they're around in times of year that are opposite of red tides. However, that does not affect or safe keep all the other wildlife. And there are mass mortality events that we see again in oceans all over the world. And in this particular year, back in 2018, we saw over so much wildlife died on Sanibel, and over 2,000 tons of dead sea life was removed just from Lee County beaches alone. And it really affected the entire state of Florida. And so a state of emergency was declared for many counties at that time. We also have looked very carefully at these toxins in wildlife, and this publication came out of my center, Loggerhead Marine Life Center, where we were able to correlate both natural biotoxins as well as man-made or sorry, not biotoxins, but toxins. We were able to correlate that with a change in turtles' immunocompetency. And what we showed was that turtles who are affected with fibropapillomatosis, which is these awful skin cancers that you see growing on this turtle, these cancers are caused by a herpes virus. And many of you probably know that herpes is one of those things that tends to kind of hide out in your body and not cause a problem unless your immune system is suppressed. And so what we found was that, some of these toxins are suppressing the immune systems of these animals, and we were able to correlate both mercury and brevetoxin concentrations with tumor scores. So we think this is one reason why we're seeing such a huge concentration of turtles being affected by these tumors in my particular area. And double-crested cormorants are really the poster child for brevetoxicosis, but certainly many other species are affected. And you can see this is a map demonstrating exactly what I told you guys, which is here is Lake Okeechobee and this smaller map. And then if you follow the Caloosahatchee River all the way down, you can see it's dumping right here onto Sanibel. And that's probably why this is such a hotbed for brevetoxicosis. So all the yellow dots that you see are sites where birds with that were documented to have brevetoxicosis were recovered from. And so, again, really a hotbed of problem there. And we certainly were able to correlate multiple times in multiple studies that when the red tide events are occurring, we definitely see many more animals being affected. And certainly, the frequency of clinical signs, most of these guys have neurologic signs. However, they can have a wide variety of different clinical signs. So, not just neurologic signs like stumbling around and tremoring and being very depressed. They can have GI signs like diarrhea and vomiting. They can have very low heart rate. They can lose the ability to blink their eyes and many other things. And in fact, when humans are exposed to red tides, typically they are exposed by walking along the beach and breathing in the aerosolized toxins that come from the waves kind of crashing on the beach and breaking open those algal particles and releasing those toxins into the air. And so most people usually have coughing and their eyes get very irritated and their throat gets very irritated. And that happens in birds too. However, we found that most of these birds were coughing not because of them breathing in the toxins, but probably because of this particular type of worm that had not been documented previously in cormorants. But here I'm just looking down the windpipe of this bird with a scope, and we were able to document this species of worm for the first time in these animals. And certainly, when animals are affected, then again, wildlife can really be sentinels for human health. So they're kind of like that canary in the coal mine where as long as somebody's watching the canary, then the miners can also be warned if there are some toxins in the air that they're breathing. And that's really how I look at wildlife too, because certainly when red tides were occurring, sometimes we were the first to know at Crow, and we would reach out to county health officials and say, hey, you might want to test the water in this area because we think there may be a harmful algal bloom there. And it turns out wildlife can be really great sentinels, which may protect both human and domestic animal health. Certainly, wildlife may be exposed to brevetoxins through breathing them, but also from ingestion to water and also ingestion of exposed prey items. And so that's what we see here is this loggerhead is munching on a lobster and this cormy is munching on a fish. And both of these guys can potentially get brevetoxicosis from their prey. And I don't need you guys to, sort of understand this chart, but basically what this chart is saying is that brevetoxin levels vary quite a bit depending on the species of bird. However, there were no correlation between the levels of brevetoxin and either the clinical signs or their survival probabilities. And so we thought that was pretty interesting. Also, many of these birds are very anemic, and so sometimes, they're dying not from the toxin, but from the anemia that the toxin is causing, as well as failure of both liver and kidneys. And so we were able to correlate and show that animals with very low protein levels, which they're probably losing proteins through their gastrointestinal tract because of all that bleeding, through their kidneys, and also through their liver. And that correlated very well with survival probability, which is what we showed in this particular study. And essentially, what we showed was that regardless of how we tried to treat them, survival in wildlife was very, very poor until I developed a treatment for brevetoxicosis, which was intravenous lipid emulsion therapy, or IVLE. And prior to IVLE, birds that were both anemic and hypoproteinemic that had brevetoxicosis only had about a 32% chance of survival unless we gave them blood or plasma transfusions. Eventually, we got very good at treating this disease. We would give them oxygen, blood transfusions if they needed it, and then intravenous fluids and a lot of supportive care. But the mainstay of treatment, in addition to assist feeding them and making sure we took care of their ulcers, was intravenous lipid emulsion therapy. And this was a very reasonable cost for this treatment. And what we showed in the study that we did is that 85% survived if they were treated with intravenous lipid emulsion, compared to only 56% in the control group. And that control group got every other form of treatment that we just talked about. So they got blood transfusions if they needed it, antibiotics if they needed it, all the things. The only difference in treatment between the two groups was IVLE. And not only did more survive, but their clinical signs resolved much more rapidly. And so we were able to take that information and apply it to many other species, including humans, sea turtles, manatees, dolphins, lots of animals being treated now with IVLE. And that is going to do it for me. I will now open up the floor for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Heather. I definitely see more why you were in Washington advocating on behalf of wildlife when we met you.
Right?
I do want to make a quick note, and then I have a question for you. And folks, Q&A if you would, or chat. Um, I want to tell folks that a couple things. One is that if this topic concerns you as much as it does us, um, we are going to Washington, D.C. in a couple weeks to visit with our members of Congress about these sorts of topics, and we would be happy to carry a letter from you to our senators or your representative at that time. So we're going September 8th. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I think a lot of folks on here know it, but please send me a letter. We'll be happy to deliver it for you, asking for maybe a little bit of action on these pollutants that are entering our environment. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that Ethan, particularly here in Missouri, works a lot in the water space, if you will, often with a coalition of other Missouri conservation organizations. And if you would like to get involved in work on this topic, we are here for you. So I'm going to put our both of our emails in the chat. Heather, I wanted to ask you. Um, with so I feel like this like we're in like a bit of a quandary, right? So like with what we know about endocrine disrupting chemicals also in plastic, what are our options people wise? Because a lot of our tap water, as you presented, is not a great option, but neither is drinking out of plastic bottles, not just for
Mhm.
the environmental part of it, but also, the exposure part of it from human health perspective. So what do you recommend?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to add, I also put my email in the chat for you guys in case we don't answer all your questions tonight. Certainly, I think the big underscore here is don't drink out of plastic bottles. It's not just bad for the environment, it's horribly bad for you as well, particularly if you don't know how that bottle was treated because plastic water bottles that get hot, there's a lot more leachates into the water that you're drinking. So all the bad things that are in the plastics, if you have left that bottle, sitting in your car, if it sat in a hot truck prior to delivery, a lot of the, bisphenols and other bad things that are in those plastics are definitely going to leach out. And I think certainly the probably the best thing you can do is have lots of really high quality filters on your water, and then hope for the best because your government is probably doing very little to protect you certainly right now. Yeah, there are a lot of things that we need to do to protect ourselves. And it is so concerning, not just from the health of ourselves and the health of the planet, but for the health of our children. It's, very distressing. For me, as a wildlife veterinarian and mother of three, it's super concerning. And so yeah, I do everything I can, and I appreciate everything you guys are doing. Ellen asked, "What can we do to help this situation?" I think the best thing is, political pressure because unfortunately, it is really only governments that are going to control industry, and it really is industries that are, predominantly polluting our environments and there's so much that we can do if we are educated and we know how to put political pressure on, right? You think, for years, sugar was the primary industry in the state of Florida, right? And arsenic is one of the primary things that they use to process that sugar. So arsenic levels were super, super high here. And all of these things really have resulted in Florida's water is just disgusting. And it really wasn't until we started having all these harmful algal blooms and people started putting pressure on our government here in the state of Florida that all of a sudden Florida woke up and any politician you talk to actually at least says they're concerned about water quality in the state of Florida because the average person got angry and they started going to meetings at Captains for Clean Water and fishermen got angry and people started talking to the representatives and tourism tanked here that one year where we had red tide year round all over the state of Florida, like, the tourists just stayed away in droves, so not only did it cost us from, you know, billions of animals die because the thousands and thousands that washed up on our shores that we tried to treat around the state of Florida. Clearly, that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? Because this is marine wildlife, and so most of them were dying and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And we had lots of scientists that were really doing a great job at proving how impactful these red tides were. And Human emergency room admissions went way up, tourism went way down. It is so impactful on, the state's bottom line, and that was really what the politicians needed to see. They needed to understand, why should I care? Why should my average constituent care? And I think, the good news is scientists are out there doing great science and they're publishing it all over the place. The bad news is scientists have trouble taking their findings and helping the average person relate to them. So, the more you as individuals can be educated and educate your friends, your family, go on your social media and make a big deal out of it, because scientists have lost credibility for whatever reason. The average human is questioning why scientists are doing what they're doing and whether or not they can actually believe the science. And I think that that's a um, gross misfortune for our Earth as a whole.
Thank, thank you, Dr. Barron. I really appreciate this discussion and your topic and your expertise on this and the way that you presented it. It really pulls that common thread together across a variety of topics. There's so much intersectionality with the different topics we focus on, whether it's plastics, water pollution issues, other toxin issues. And I really appreciate how you brought the attention to that very precious resource of water. And this last weekend, we put on a workshop on clean water from the ground up. People were really engaged, very much focused on toxicity and things like that. And that one question we got there, what can you do, is such a great one. I completely agree. It's that kind of pressure, public awareness and pressure. We do, fortunately, have a lot of resources. Dana mentioned you can reach out to us for Missouri specific actions. And when I think of those, on the top of my list right now would be, when you were mentioning that there's regulations on the amount of certain sort of things in the water, I think of total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs. They're coming up in Missouri again. The public comment period is open on those in Missouri right now. I just threw in some things in the chat so you guys can check them out. But really, it's very complicated. It can be complicated if you're not familiar with the methodology. But think of like things like our 11 point river is actually an impaired waterway because of mercury. They found it in Tish Fishew back in the day. So there's all sorts of pollutants and things, and we really need to pay attention. We can't really rely at this time maybe on the EPA as setting the bar, and the state really wants to say, let's let EPA set the bar. So there's also a public rulemaking comment period on. So if you want to keep engaged with those things, reach out to Dana and I. We'll keep you dialed in and we'll help bring you resources to be able to put that pressure on.
Thank you guys. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And again, if you guys have any further questions, I know our time is up, but I am always happy to talk to anybody interested in wildlife health and how they might help and how we can make the earth a healthier place for all of us who live here.
Thank you so much.
On that note, good night, everyone. Thank you, Heather. Take action, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.